Our presenter for the webinar today is Sherry Davidoff. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherry has been called a cybersecurity badass by the New York Times. Her new book, Data Breaches: Crisis and Opportunity, is available now. Over her 19-year career, she has conducted cybersecurity training for an array of organizations, including the Department of Defense, the American Bar Association, and the FDIC. Her professional experiences are featured in the book Breaking and Entering: The Extraordinary Story of a Hacker Called Alien. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and penetration tester with the GPEN, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Sherry, I am passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you, Stevie, and welcome everybody. I'm excited we have such a nice crowd today. So we are going to start by talking about the top threats of 2020. Can't believe it's already 2020, but looking back, there's a lot we've learned. We'll begin by talking about a new twist on ransomware. Ransomware, of course, has been a problem for several years, and these days criminals are finding even more creative ways to leverage it and to extract money from people, especially as we start to learn how to respond to it. They're getting more creative. So we'll talk about that. We will discuss supply chain exploitation, how criminals and organized crime groups are targeting suppliers in order to get a foothold into many more organizations and scale up. And then finally, we'll discuss cloud hacking, something that's really been on the forefront of the headlines in the past year. Along the way, we'll talk about things you can do to reduce your risk, because all of these are controllable risks. But speaking of risks, I had a question ahead of time, and again, thanks to those of you who sent questions in ahead of time, that was really helpful. Someone asked, how are bad actors using the coronavirus to circumvent security protocols? And as soon as I saw that question, I thought, oh no, because it's true. Whenever there's some major event in the world or a crisis, cyber criminals are going to think about taking advantage of it. The FTC just published an article that says, scammers follow the headlines. So now that coronavirus is on the forefront of everyone's attention, we're seeing phishing emails, we're seeing product scams. You can see on the right-hand side, this is a phishing email that Kaspersky published, one that's becoming very popular. So they're including a link and saying, here's a list of new cases around your city. So you want to click on that link in order to see who's infected with coronavirus around you, something that's very tempting for a lot of people. And it asks for a username and password in this case. So this is the type of phishing email that's designed to get people's passwords. We've also seen in the past, the CDC has actually published samples of phishing emails regarding the flu in general, and we're expecting to see those in coronavirus as well, where criminals send attachments saying, here's a list of people with the flu, and then the victims open it, and boom, their computers get infected. So we're seeing two different types of phishing emails. The password one seems to be specifically targeted at coronavirus, and we've also seen ones with attachments targeted at the flu, mimicking the CDC in the past. So something, unfortunately, to bring to the attention of your staff. Watch out for this. Don't fall for those phishing emails. We also see a lot of product scams, so people who are selling hand sanitizer at very inflated prices and then not actually sending it, or sometimes criminals will buy products and then not actually pay for them or reverse the payment after the product has already been sent. That's just sort of standard, but it's certainly elevated in times of crisis. We see fake fundraising campaigns. So there's some sad story about someone with coronavirus and they're raising money, and it turns out that it's all fake. So again, things just to watch out for if you're donating to charity or really just sending money anywhere. Really dot your I's, cross your T's, and watch out. The other thing to think about is the possible impact of multi-component attacks. And in security, we've been talking about this for a couple decades now. But whenever there is a major crisis, such as coronavirus, any attacks, like cyber attacks, the effects of them can be magnified. So for example, we have a ton of people in the United States who are working from home right now. If there is a denial of service attack that affects their connectivity, that could have a dramatic impact on our economy. So again, something to watch out for. We're especially vulnerable in these times. The things that you can do are to educate your staff and to talk now and come up with contingency plans. So thanks for that question, very timely. So now we're going to jump in to the cyber attack side of things. And even when there's a crisis going on, we can't take our eye off the ball because ransomware is still happening, cloud attacks are still happening, and cyber criminals will take advantage of those loopholes and the fact that people are a little bit distracted. So one thing that's been going on is a change to the way that ransomware operations are trying to extract money from people. So the Maze ransomware group traditionally targeted corporations and aimed to lock up their data, like we've seen with other ransomware groups. Starting around November, December, we saw a shift. They started locking up data, and then if they didn't receive a payment, they threatened to publish it. So here are a couple recent examples. They published a Texas law firm's confidential data after that law firm did not pay. And that meant things like pain diaries that are absolutely protected under federal law, HIPAA-related documentation, all kinds of client-related information. So something to watch out for. We've also seen Prince Edward Island got hacked, apparently. The Maze Group set up a dedicated website, and the Prince Edward Island government was hacked, and a lot of sensitive information was released. I think it was about 50 gigabytes, unfortunately, including spreadsheets, PDFs, text files, zip files, sensitive information. So they're trying to extort people, and then if they don't receive that payment, they dump the data, make it an example for other people. Here's a screenshot of what their website looks like. We grabbed this from LMG's laboratory. So again, it says, represented here are companies that don't wish to cooperate with us, try to hide our successful attack on their resources. So companies might say, oh, I have ransomware, we're just gonna handle it quietly, clean up, and move on. But it turns out that the Maze Group is actually stealing data before they ever even launch the ransomware attack. And that way they've got something up their sleeve so that if they don't receive that payment, they can extort them and they can use them as an example for others. I think the attack on Southwire, the United States leading manufacturer of cables and wires, is a great example. So in December, unfortunately, Southwire was attacked, and the Maze Group demanded a $6 million ransom. Now, it turns out Southwire apparently had pretty decent backups. They also caught the ransomware incident fairly quickly, so they weren't completely down, but they did decide to proactively quarantine systems and shut down their operations. This impacted this disrupted their operations. They sent out a notice to their customers and to other key stakeholders, letting them know. So it absolutely had a business impact, but they were able to get back up and running, so good for them. The problem is that the Maze Group had already stolen information from them. And so they used Southwire as an example. They put them up on the Maze's website and threatened to expose their data unless that ransom was paid. And Southwire's response was fascinating. So instead of just quietly ignoring it, they said, you know what? We're going to sue. Oh, and here's the ransom note from Maze. I think this is important to keep in mind. The ransom note itself says, we've downloaded a lot of data from your network. In case of not paying this data, will be released. Not the best grammar. If you don't believe we have any data, you can contact us. Also, you can Google Allied Universal. So Allied Universal Security was a physical security services company that they had hacked a month previously. So again, they're using these companies as examples to try to pressure new victims into paying. And Southwire didn't take the bait. Instead, Southwire sued them, which to a lot of cybersecurity specialists sounded a little crazy, like, okay, you're going to sue these criminals, what good does that do? Turns out it absolutely can do some good. So number one, in the event that the criminals are caught, and occasionally criminals do get caught, it might give them some standing in terms of recovering some damages. So that's helpful. But also they filed an injunction in Ireland and were able to require the hosting provider to take down the Maze Group's website. So boom, all the data that the Maze Group had tried to leak is offline. Unfortunately, a week later, the Maze Group came right back. They relaunched in another country. It's very hard to keep these cybercriminal groups from hosting their information somewhere on the internet. As you can see with WikiLeaks, there's just a machine that they've built up. It's something that I talk about in my book. The mega leaks phenomenon has led to this creation of a bulletproof infrastructure that is almost impossible to take down if the organized crime groups really wanted to remain up. So Maze relaunched their website, outed Southwire, started publishing all their sensitive information. And they're not alone. After Maze did this, actually, this has been a little bit of a trend. So Sedinakibi is another group that we've been monitoring closely over the past year. At LMG, we specialize in ransomware response. It's one of our specialties. And we have seen Sedinakibi affecting many different clients. So Sedinakibi, that group infected a data center, Cyrus1, and took over 6 different customer networks because they had access to this managed service provider and data center. So here you can see the news articles. U.S. data center provider hit by ransomware attack. CyberSwing confirmed that ransomware attack. What I think is interesting is that these criminals, Sedinikibi, actually referred to their compliance requirements. So they said, we've opened a separate division which is engaged in large operations. These are the criminals opening a separate division. That's how organized and corporate sounding they are. A week ago, access to CyrusOne was made. Judging by the media, they're not going to pay. And then they go on to say, in case of refusal of payment, the data will either be sold to competitors or laid out in open sources. GDPR, do not want to pay us? Pay 10 times more to the government, no problems. So they're invoking these compliance requirements and pointing out that, hey, it's probably cheaper to pay us and keep it quiet than it is to just for us to release this. It's cheaper to pay the criminals than to just ignore it and have to pay a regulatory fine. And that's not new. We've seen that for a few years. We're going to get into that in a couple minutes. By the way, feel free to ask questions as you go along, and Stevie, feel free to shout them out. Happy to take questions, and we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. Since then, we have started to see copycat attacks. So this is DoppelLeaks, which was launched by the Doppelpaymer gang. In this case, you can see on the left, they've hacked a company called Pemex, a Mexican petroleum company, and they released all their data. So Sedinikibi, again, just in the past couple months, threatened to publish the data of an automotive group, GEDIA Automotive Group, released things like drawings and internal test results, employee data, all kinds of sensitive information. So this seems to be becoming a trend. It's not just Maze, it's also some of the other leading organized crime groups that are getting on this bandwagon and using it as a tactic. And why not? So again, I call this exposure extortion. Again, I have a whole chapter on this in my book on data breaches. Exposure extortion is not a new thing. What's new about it is the level of organization and scalability. Here we see from 2016, the Dark Overlord, a very famous and impactful hacking group. They would break into organizations with the goal of holding them for ransom. So we saw them specifically targeting media companies like Netflix. In some cases, like in the Netflix case, they actually targeted a supplier, a small business that was doing some processing on their behalf, and then used that to release some videos. We also see them targeting healthcare organizations, in particular smaller ones that were very vulnerable. So here on the second tweet, you can see they said, don't mind us as we dust off 3,500 dentistry patient records. So that means that they hacked a dental clinic, the dental clinic didn't pay the ransom, and boom, the Dark Overlord is making an example of them. And then another clinic also did not respond, did not pay, and then they released some sensitive information as well. And unfortunately, it's the patients in those cases that are caught in the middle. Now here you can also see the Dark Overlord was targeting school districts very effectively. Among those tactics, they made sure to include things like contact information for superintendents. They hacked into schools and grabbed contact information for parents and were texting the parents. I have friends whose kids were in some of those affected school districts, and they got text messages threatening their kids' lives. Very frightening. And the criminals didn't actually have access to harm the students, but they certainly could cause fear and get the community itself to put pressure on the superintendent to potentially pay the ransom. Again, the difference is that modern ransomware software is scalable. It's sophisticated. What you're looking at here is a screenshot of the Sedinikibi web portal in LMG's laboratory. And you can see it's a commercial software product. Once the victim gets infected, they're able to access this portal. It gives them the amount of time they have left, 6 days, 23 hours, 58 minutes, 24 seconds. It says the current price of getting their data. There's even things like instructions that walk you through. There's resources for how to buy Bitcoins, and there's chat support. If you want to make sure that they actually can decrypt your files, there is a built-in proof of life checker. That's what we call it, because when you do kidnapping negotiations, you want to verify that your hostage is alive. And the same is true for your data. You want to verify that the criminals can actually give you your data back. So in this case, they have it built in. Both the criminals and the negotiators know that this is just a part of the process. You uploaded an image file, typically a JPEG or PNG. They use the decryption key to decrypt it, send you back the original, and that verifies that they are in possession of that key and they know how to use it. So nowadays, it's the same groups that make these very scalable and sophisticated software platforms that are then stealing your data and also trying to conduct exposure extortion. So we have information stealing software that they're deploying first. They steal all the information they want. Sometimes they'll analyze it. They're using turnkey ransomware programs to encrypt your data and launch a platform. And then if you decide not to pay, they threaten to expose your data. Boom, 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 1, 2, 3. Very scalable. If you are hit with an exposure threat, somebody says, hey, pay the ransomware, we're going to expose your data to the world, that is one of those cases where best practice is never to pay. And with a normal ransomware case, I shouldn't say normal because I don't think holding people for ransom is normal. In a traditional ransomware case where they're just locking up your data, in my opinion, paying the ransom is a business decision. Sometimes companies pay it, sometimes they don't. There are a lot of factors that go into making that decision. But when you're dealing with exposure threats, there is no upside to paying that ransom for them to not publish their data, because you lose the money. They might still publish your data, and they could also come back to you in 6 months or a year and say, hey, pay us again, or we're going to publish it again. A lot of times they'll reassure you, oh no, we definitely delete it, trust us. But really, how much can you trust the criminals? And then if you do pay it and you keep quiet, you've got a skeleton in your closet. And even if it's a very fashionable skeleton, nobody wants a skeleton in their closet. So remember, when you get ransomware, if you get ransomware, typically that's just the tip of the iceberg. That is often the last thing criminals do. Often we find they've been in the network for anywhere between 3 weeks to a couple months before they decide, or more, before they decide to detonate that ransomware. And we've seen in several cases in the news lately, the criminals were in the network, and when they launched ransomware, the company responded within 90 minutes or less. Were able to shut it down, and then a week later they would get hit with an exposure threat. So if you detect ransomware, there is a decent chance that the criminals have already stolen your data. This is a screenshot from a real case where the company found out that they had been hacked and were being held for ransom, and they decided to try to negotiate. This was before LMG got involved. They said, hey, sorry, we can't pay this ransom, it's too much for us. And the criminals came back and said, the price is appropriate according to your financials. So they had seen the company's financials, and they often analyze that information. They'll grab your P&L, they'll grab your balance sheet, find out how much revenue you make, and use that as information when they're establishing their ransom demand so that they know what's appropriate. And then they go on to say, in this case, we can make the 25% discount for fast payment. So, you know, they're business people. Okay, here's a typical infection pattern. So again, this is from a real case that we handled in September, and this was a client that found out they had ransomware when all their files were encrypted. So in November, they find out there's this Ryuk infection. But when you start to go back through the logs, you see that they were actually infected in September, and the criminals were there stealing data. And it wasn't until November that, boom, they decided to launch the ransomware. So this is a curse and a blessing. It does mean that usually there is plenty of time to intervene and detect these criminals before they actually try to lock up your data. They are in there. In this case, you can see there's alerts that are happening. There are logs that are being generated. And the problem in this case was that no one was monitoring those logs, or sometimes someone's monitoring but is overwhelmed and doesn't have the resources to respond. So it's something to think about. If you don't have the resources to respond to all of your alerts, that is very common, and you should consider outsourcing your monitoring. So again, these are controllable risks. Ransomware is a controllable risk, and you can reduce your risk. So number one, take steps to prevent phishing attacks from working. You can educate your staff. You can set up technical measures to prevent spam from coming into their inboxes. The big theme of the day is coronavirus, so make sure that your staff are aware of the phishing emails that they're likely to get relating to coronavirus, fake emails from the CDC or from various health departments. If you go on the FTC's website, you'll see some examples. I'll also make sure that these slides are available afterwards as a PDF, and you can see the link to the FTC website in that. Make sure you're doing password security. You're taking proper precautions for password security. We're going to get into that a little more in a bit, but that's one way that ransomware gets installed. And that you're doing proactive threat hunting and monitoring. This is huge. Again, the criminals are lurking in people's networks for weeks, if not for months. So taking that time to proactively look for them, antivirus software is not always going to alert. And then finally, making sure that you're backing up your data. That's also not a silver bullet. You can still get hit with exposure threats, but number one, make sure that you can operationally get back up and running. That takes a lot of the pressure off. Here's a little good news. In 2020, the Dark Overlord, the hacking group that we mentioned earlier, a key member of the Dark Overlord group was actually found and extradited and will be put on trial in the United States. That happened in December. So, you know, we're making progress as cyber defenders. I had another question. Will mobile phone malware become a threat? I love this question because almost everybody these days has a phone. A lot of them are smartphones. They're just tiny little computers that you keep in your pocket that can also record the audio of the room, and it's a little scary when you think about it. But the fact is that even though mobile malware exists, it does not appear to be really on the rise. Here's an example of the Android file coder malware that we saw coming out last summer. We do see more malware that's being developed for Android devices as opposed to Apple devices, but we do see there is malware for both of them. However, most cyber criminal organizations are looking for that big payout right now, and so they want to attack corporate networks. And it is just harder to really take over a corporate network when you start by attacking a cell phone as opposed to when you attack a desktop. So we're seeing cyber criminal organizations really targeting the desktop or the cloud, and we'll get to that in a bit, and not so much targeting mobile phones. So again, something not to lose too much sleep over. All right, moving on, let's talk about supply chain hacking. These two gentlemen that you see here have been indicted. They're on the FBI's most wanted list for hacking into at least 45 US corporations as part of the Chinese government's attack on American infrastructure. That happened at the end of 2018. And at the end of 2019, just a couple months ago, the Wall Street Journal did a major expose because they were able to dig up more information about what companies were targeted and how those companies were used to infect even more companies. So those supply chain attacks. So let's dig into this a little bit. First of all, the Wall Street Journal and other journalists were able to name many of the organizations involved, everyone from Fujitsu to IBM to Hewlett-Packard, these big names in the industry. And these companies were used to infect customers of Hewlett-Packard or IBM or Fujitsu and others. So here you can see a long list also released of customers that were involved: American Airlines, Philips, Deutsche Bank, Ericsson. Ericsson was really interesting because customers of Ericsson, the telecommunications company, were affected. So here we have companies like HP affected, their customers affected, and the customers of customers get hacked as well. And we saw some inklings of this in the news back in 2015. I actually went back and found this news article that you see here. China-linked hackers attack American Airlines Sabre Systems. Bloomberg reported this. But those were not all linked together with these dozens of other companies at the time. And now they are. This was an announcement by Sabre Corporation. They had to file an SEC report saying that they've been made aware of a cybersecurity incident involving several servers managed by a third party, and that they're conducting an investigation. And again, that is all we saw in the media at the time. It was just these little ripples, little tip of the iceberg, and we're starting to see what the full picture was. Probably still just a percentage. I got another question. Is state-sponsored hacking increasing with these international tensions? Again, a really good question. There's no good way to measure the level of state-sponsored hacking, but I can tell you that state-sponsored hackers have been well-funded for over 20 years, easily over 20 years. Back in 1996, there were reports showing that major governments were attacking each other and successfully infiltrating at the time. I do think that it's becoming more visible with investigations like what the Wall Street Journal is doing. We're starting to understand the scope. We're starting to understand that finally, after 20 years, China has a very strong foothold all throughout the American supply chain, and probably vice versa, I would imagine. That's just an educated guess. And because of that, these nation state operators are able to leverage that long-term access and use it to get into specific companies when they feel that they want to. So we'll go into some of the state-sponsored hacking. One of the things that the Wall Street Journal and Reuters reported on is how the thefts worked. So these criminals, they call it the cloud hopper attacks, they often targeted managed service providers. So we have nation state attackers targeting managed service providers, in a lot of cases small to mid-sized MSPs. But sometimes these huge companies as well. It applies to everybody. There were multiple avenues of attack. Number one, spear phishing attacks with malicious software. They would target contractors, they would target administrators that had high-level access. Someone clicks on that link and then boom, they either get credentials or their computer gets infected. If they're stealing credentials, sometimes they're dropping a keystroke logger on a victim's computer, and that way they get usernames and passwords. They also found passwords in files. So examine how you're storing your passwords. Ideally, two-factor authentication is going to be very helpful so that even if a password is stolen, criminals still can't use it to break into your systems. Because the next thing that they would do is RDP, use remote desktop, to get into the MSP's customer systems. So one MSP could effectively be used to access dozens or even hundreds or thousands of different customers. According to Reuters, armed with stolen corporate credentials, the attackers could do almost anything the service providers could do. Okay, so here you see a chart of how the APT10 hacking group actually broke into MSPs and stole data. So number one, they would compromise the managed IT service providers, and then they would target the customers, find data of interest, and collect all that data of interest in one place. Often, they would aggregate it on one customer's network. So one customer that maybe didn't do a lot of monitoring would be used to host data from potentially several other customers' networks. And then those files were compressed and exfiltrated to the managed service provider's network again, where they were used where they were then exfiltrated, or they could be exfiltrated directly from the MSP's customer network as well, depending on what was the easiest for the hackers. So that's the hacking cycle. And basically there's this overlap. There's the client infrastructure and there's the MSP infrastructure, but there are servers that both the client and the MSP infrastructure and the MSP staff could access. And those are the highest risk systems of all. Maybe, for example, systems that are used for the managed service providers to remote in, systems that are directly internet facing or easily accessible. It's not just nation state attackers that are using these tactics. We had back in August, 22 Texas towns were hit in a ransomware attack because their managed service provider was compromised. And using the software of the managed service provider, the criminals were then able to get into those 22 different towns. After that, the software provider actually started requiring two-factor authentication to be turned on by default, because it's certainly bad for their reputation if the remote access software is used to compromise different companies. Here's another one. Again, we've just been seeing this as a trend. Customers of 3 different MSPs hit in ransomware attacks. So Dinnikibi in particular, that ransomware gang was specifically targeting managed service providers because they're going for that big payout. So why go after one organization directly when you could go after one organization that will open the door to dozens or hundreds of others? And again, these are controllable risks. Remember, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, there are things you can do to protect your organization. Now, talk to your managed service provider. Step 1, really good managed service providers have a plan. They're happy to implement two-factor authentication. It reduces the risk for them as well. And so you have some options. I've talked to many managed service providers who say, we actually have more access than we need, and we wouldn't mind talking to our customers to have that narrowed down. Criminals are also figuring out that if they access a managed service provider, they can disable the backups and they can disable the disaster recovery tools. So that just makes it even worse. It really causes the crisis to escalate when they do get into the customer network. So keep that in mind. We're also seeing across the board that, unfortunately, when technology companies are hacked, that makes everybody's system-wide more vulnerable. For example, when Ericsson was hacked, some of the malware that was used in the hacking case was actually cryptographically signed with certificates stolen from big tech companies. So that means that they're evading antivirus. And this kind of thing has been in the news for a couple of years. D-Link, the manufacturer, had some important certificates stolen, and the criminals used those to sign password-stealing malware. So antivirus software looks at it and says, oh, this is cryptographically signed with a secret key that only the manufacturer can have. But in reality, someone has stolen that secret key, and so this malicious software can bypass antivirus. So how can we protect ourselves? Again, controllable risks. Number one, make sure you're doing supply chain risk assessments. For most small to mid-sized businesses, and even large ones, it's not possible to assess every supplier that you use. In fact, you may not want to assess any of them yourselves, but to verify that they're getting their own assessments done. That's a lot more scalable. So talk to your suppliers. Check out the NIST cybersecurity framework. The latest update has a section on supply chain cybersecurity that is really helpful. And it talks about how to prioritize your suppliers. So who has access to your most sensitive information? Maybe it's your MSP, maybe it's your cloud provider, maybe it's your lawyer. Take those top 3 and just focus on them. Don't let perfect get in the way of better. Even it's sometimes overwhelming for people to even think about supply chain security, but think about where your biggest risks come from, prioritize those suppliers, and tackle the first few first, and then move on from there. Also think about login security for your vendors. This is huge, and it is, again, a completely solvable challenge. So require 2-factor authentication for all your vendors. If your vendor pushes back on 2-factor authentication, that is a red flag. Make sure that you're logging their access, maybe even monitoring. If there's a login at 2 in the morning that's not explained, that should get flagged. You can also restrict access to certain times or from certain IP addresses, or restrict their access to only certain computers or files. One of our partners called SecureLink, I really like their product. They can facilitate vendor access, and they do that. And finally, we talked about limiting privileges and times. If you have any questions about that, feel free to shoot me a message afterwards. Okay, and finally, let's move on to cloud hacking. I love this quote by Microsoft himself, Brett Arsenault. He says, hackers don't break in, they log in. And that is especially true in the cloud. There are misconfigurations and things like that, even vulnerabilities, we'll get to those. But by and large, the vast majority of cases we see happen because of a lost or stolen password or a credential stuffing attack. In fact, I'm dealing with a big case involving a credential stuffing attack right now. Akamai recently reported that they saw 61 billion credential stuffing attacks in 18 months. A credential stuffing attack is when criminals take a database of stolen usernames and passwords, and they decide to try that in a bunch of other websites. So, hey, they're thinking that users are probably reusing those passwords, or maybe they're reusing slight variations on those passwords. So they're putting a 1 at the end, or changing 2019 to 2020, or maybe you're changing winter to spring. I am on to you guys. If you just changed winter to spring in your password, go change it again. So that's what a credential stuffing attack is. And again, 61 billion credential stuffing attacks in 18 months. This is an epidemic. Here you can see that Ring announced that there at least 3,000 doorbell and camera accounts were vulnerable to hackers. It is possible to get lists of passwords off the dark web and to check your customer usernames and passwords. We actually collect some of those here at LMG and check in some cases to see if the entry point might have been an employee or a customer password. So they're recommending that Ring users change their passwords, enable 2-factor authentication. Same thing with State Farm. State Farm did not have a vulnerability in their system, and yet here's their headline: State Farm falls victim to credential stuffing attack. What's going on is that their customers are reusing passwords. I don't even want to say choosing weak passwords, but because they could be the strongest passwords in the world. They could be 25 characters. If the user clicked on a link and has their password stolen and reuses that in different places, they can still get their accounts hacked. So reusing passwords is a huge problem. It's something that's very difficult to control, but it is the source of a lot of cybersecurity incidents these days. One of the reasons why credential stuffing attacks are so prevalent is because such a huge number of passwords have been stolen and are now available either for sale or for free on the dark web. You can see at this time last year, collection number 1 had just come out. And that revealed 773 million email addresses and passwords all in one place. And here's a picture of collection number 1 if you're curious about what it looks like. It's literally just collections of different password dumps all cobbled together. There was also a really nice report by Google where they monitored the dark web for 1 year and found almost 2 billion username and password combinations have been leaked. And that is almost certainly, again, just the tip of the iceberg, because there are plenty of password dumps that are either available for free or for sale in private forums that researchers can't see. So those are all being stolen. The other thing that's making credential stuffing so common is that tools are readily available. So this is a tool called Sniper. It's available for 20 bucks on the internet. And it's actually pretty user-friendly, easy to use. You just upload usernames and passwords and click where you want to try them out, and it will automatically check those usernames and passwords in a lot of popular websites. Many times these stolen usernames and passwords are being used to break into email. And you can't underestimate the amount of damage that this has caused. Many employees kind of wave off the value of their email or say, oh, I don't have anything important in there, I don't have anything interesting. But the fact is that criminals are breaking into your email and they're automatically looking for things like invoices or wire transfers. And if you have someone who works in anything relating to finance or management, often the criminals are able to intercept an email communication, convince someone, trick them into changing where a payment is going. And then they also redirect any follow-up emails so that the parties involved don't see them and don't communicate until that money is long gone. So the FBI estimates that it's cost companies at least $26 billion since 2016. I suspect that's a gross underestimate because we frequently see wire transfer fraud losses that range from $25,000 all the way up to almost $1 million in one hit. And victim companies are not calling the media or the FBI in a lot of cases to report this. Sometimes they don't even find out about it for a month or two, and at that point it is way too late to claw that money back. Oh, here you can see the attackers are looking for invoice. They're also interested in your email because they can steal sensitive and juicy information. And if you end up finding out that an email account is hacked, you might have to do e-discovery and take an inventory of all the data in it. Keep in mind that a lot of people treat email like a big file cabinet. You might have emails from 6 years ago, 10 years ago even. If there's even one spreadsheet with a bunch of people's social security numbers or tax IDs or vendor information, that can formally be a data breach and cause you to have to notify and announce publicly that this occurred. So scary stuff, definitely causing a lot of damage. One audience question that I get a lot is, how do you notice if an email breach has occurred? A lot of people don't find out about it until money has gone missing. And again, the good news is that there are early symptoms of this, and you can detect it long before the money actually goes missing. Here's one example on the right of an alert from Microsoft's Office 365 that says, hey, a mail redirect has occurred. That means that somebody's email has been forwarded to an attacker at like gmail.com or something like that. We see that very commonly in cases. So email starts to get forwarded. And once it starts to get forwarded, again, that can count as a data breach, but that should be a trigger for your team to do something. And often this alert happens and it gets missed. Whoever's supposed to watch it is busy with other things, or maybe you just don't have a strong monitoring program or a strong response program. So ideally, you get an alert like this, it gets blocked, or someone takes quick action to prevent that mail redirect from occurring, follows up and makes sure that passwords are changed, things like that. Other ways that you notice an email data breach are emails from your account that you didn't send, unexpected mail rules, new folders, messages that are read and deleted that you didn't read or delete. These are things to educate your staff about. You might also have issues with invoices and wire transfer fraud. Again, kind of like ransomware, that's usually the last thing that happens. That's kind of the payload after the attacker has been in the system for a while. So let's pause here and talk about solutions. Again, there are so many great ways to prevent this from happening. You can prevent these problems. It really goes back to the fundamentals of authentication. We have had the technology to prevent password theft from becoming a huge problem for many, many years. So in cybersecurity, there's 3 ways to authenticate a person. That means to verify your identity with something you know, like a password, something you have, could be a token, could be an app on your mobile phone, and finally with something you are. That could be your fingerprint or facial recognition, biometrics. So something you know, something you have, something you are. When we talk about multi-factor authentication or 2-factor authentication, we mean we're using more than one method to authenticate people. And these days, given that passwords are stolen so frequently, single-factor authentication that relies just on passwords is not something you can rely on anymore. In fact, I would recommend when you think about passwords, if you have an account that's internet facing and protected only by a password, assume that it is hacked or will be hacked soon. You run, don't walk after this webinar, and start on your game plan to put 2-factor authentication in place. And if you've already done that, good job, you are awesome. So also another great thing that's happened are Authenticator Apps. So 10 years ago, when we started to see a lot of thefts from bank accounts, Authenticator Apps were not an option. You had to have those little hardware tokens, and they would cost a lot of money. They were difficult to deploy. I had customers that worked with multiple banks, and they would have multiple tokens on a keyring with little PIN numbers sticky notes taped to them. These days, you don't have to worry about that. We can use Authenticator Apps. So here you see Google Authenticator. It can give you a code, or it can just do a push notification, which I think is the best approach, and says approve sign-in, approve, or deny, and the user will either approve or deny it. So you have cheap and easy options. 77% of Americans these days have a smartphone, and over 95% of Americans have a phone at all, a cell phone. So even for customers, 2-factor authentication is an option, and we've seen the major social networking platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, Office 365 are all offering these routinely. If you want to see some videos of how to very quickly and easily set up 2-factor authentication for your account, go to lmgsecurity.com/passwords. Here's another question I get a lot. Is 2-factor authentication foolproof? This is a great question. The answer, sadly, is no, but some methods are much more secure than others. So I wrote a blog recently called Not All 2-Factor Authentication is Created Equal. Check it out. We talk about what is strong 2-factor authentication and what is weak, what are some weaker forms of 2-factor authentication that we need to move away from. One of those weaker forms is PINs that are sent through text message. So I know I can't see you, but let's pretend in your mind, raise your hands if you've ever had a bank send a text message to your phone with a PIN number. Yeah, I can see that's a lot of you. That's a lot of us. You get that PIN and then you use that to log in. And the problem is that those PIN numbers can be intercepted in a number of different places. Number one, they're not encrypted as they go through the network. And the cell phone network is a big black box to many of us. But just like with email, unencrypted text messages are insecure and can be intercepted in transit. We've also seen a rash of SIM swapping attacks, and that means that attackers can basically take over your phone number, either for short periods of time or for longer periods of time. They can do this in a number of ways. They can call your provider and say, hey, I got a new phone and I have this person's social security number. You know, they verify your identity using knowledge that they have. And then all of a sudden, all of your text messages, including those PINs, get sent to their phone. That happens more frequently than you want to know. They can also visit a store. There have also been scam groups, organized crime groups, that were paying off employees of major telecommunications providers to just steal phone numbers that would allow them to get these banking PINs. Here you can see an article because Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey was even hit in a SIM swap attack. And there are some easy ways you can prevent against those. You can call your provider or use an app and set a PIN so that criminals can't just use your social security number to set up a new phone. They have to also know the secret PIN that only you and your telecommunications provider know. 2-factor authentication can also be bypassed. I don't love the code method where you type a code into a website because criminals are very good at making fake websites. This is a fake Microsoft website. It says type in the code displayed on your device. And even though it's a fake website, the criminals will in real time pass that code along to Office 365 or wherever it is that they're trying to log into and get in. So they can just set up a phishing site and steal that code along with your username and password. It's a little trickier, you know, it's not like a password that's good forever, but it gets them in the door. Reddit if you're curious as to whether these are practical attacks, they are. Reddit confirmed that they had a data breach of user details, and it was because employees did have two-factor authentication turned on, but criminals actually stole the text messages that were going to their phones and used that to break into those accounts. And because of that, Reddit had to announce a data breach. So some other things to consider: what are your fallback options? If you allow for insecure fallback options, like let's say normally you use an app, but if you were to lose your phone with the app, then you've configured Office 365 or Gmail to just send you a text. Criminals will try that. They'll say, okay, we don't have access to the app, but maybe we can just use another method, the backup method, and get it to send you a text. So unfortunately, they will try that. You need to go in and turn off that backup method, or again, your account is still accessible potentially to criminals. So what are our best practices? Make sure you're using strong two-factor authentication. An app is much stronger than text messages. Love those push notifications. It's nice when security and convenience line up. Those push notifications are easier for users and they're harder to steal. Turn off that SMS-based authentication. If you're using the cloud, check that your cloud providers support strong authentication methods like 2FA, and then add a PIN or a passphrase to your cellular accounts. Okay, finally, just to wrap this up, we are seeing a lot of criminals targeting shared architecture flaws. And Capital One is a great example. Capital One was hacked and over 100 million people's personal information was stolen because of a common misconfiguration. And they weren't alone. I love this graphic, by the way. There's no cloud, there's just other people's computers. Often we put information in the cloud and we think, okay, we're done, it's up there, the cloud provider is taking care of it. But this is just someone else's computer. And we're trusting that person with our data, or that company with our data, but we may not understand what's our responsibility and what's the company's responsibility. And in some cases, that happens a lot. So Amazon tries to be very clear that they're responsible for security of the cloud, and Capital One is responsible, in this case, responsible for the security of their data in the cloud. And we'll get to some of that debate in a little bit. How did the Capital One hack happen? Well, the Capital One hacker almost certainly scanned the internet and found a metadata service that was configured incorrectly. It allowed them to get access to some credentials that should not have been exposed to the internet, but often are because of a common flaw, common misconfiguration. It's important to note that this was not an isolated incident to Capital One. There had been a researcher named Brennan Thomas who presented about this at a B-Sides event in June of 2019. And he found that there were over 800 AWS instances that were insecure and misconfigured in exactly this way. There was actually a scanner tool that hackers knew about and were using regularly. And he found, you can see in the screenshot at the bottom, tons of usernames and passwords that were available. So the hacker absolutely had access to this scanner tool and knew about this vulnerability like many other people. So not surprisingly, there was a headline that pointed out that the Capital One hacker not only took data from Capital One, but also at least 30 other companies. We know that because their information was also found in the same repository, and there could have been many other companies that were also targeted. So of course, we've seen 30 other companies reporting data breaches, right? I don't know about fortunately or unfortunately, but not so much. Often the data breaches we see are literally the tip of the iceberg. There are many more data breaches that are either not reported yet, or for one reason or another will never be reported. Amazon came out, there was some finger pointing here, especially because the attacker was a former Amazon employee. And she did not use any special knowledge. She was undoubtedly familiar with the systems, but anybody could have conducted this attack. Amazon says, hey, it's not our fault. Our cloud services were not compromised. It was not a vulnerability. But then quietly, a few months later, they made some improvements. They said, oh, the existing service is totally secure, but here's a new version with belts and suspenders protection that gives you extra protection against 4 types of vulnerabilities. So what's happening is that cloud providers are responsible for what the infrastructure itself, what is possible. It was not even possible as a customer to require authentication to protect some of the juicy information in that metadata service. It was not possible to create defense in depth the way you might have liked because of limitations within the environment that Amazon had created. And that has been changed, but it's not changed by default. So something to keep in mind. Okay, we've also seen, again, misconfigurations. Microsoft themselves announced a customer data breach just in the first quarter. They accidentally left 250 million customer service records open to the web because of a misconfiguration in Azure. And if even Microsoft themselves misconfigures Azure, what does that mean for the rest of us? Again, there are there's insecure defaults and very common issues with the user interface that can lead to mistakes. Here's another example. In Microsoft Azure, if you're creating a virtual machine, by default, the remote desktop protocol is wide open. So that means that anyone on the internet can access your virtual machine by default. And they do this because in a lot of cases, people want it to be available and they don't want to create a barrier to functionality. Unfortunately, it causes a security problem by default. If you look on Shodan, the search engine for internet-facing devices, there are over 200,000 instances of accessible Microsoft Azure instances just out there where anyone could try to log in with the username and password. And there's also, if you look, 35 sneakier ones that are accessible on an unusual port, for those of you that are technical geeks like me. If you're moving your RDP service to a different port, you are not hiding, you're not stopping anybody. Attackers can still see that. Also, monitoring is disabled by default and in the cloud. This is in AWS. And unfortunately, many people do not realize that until a cloud hacking case occurs and you go back to look at the logs and see what happened, and they're not there because they're disabled. So they're disabled by default. You can enable detailed monitoring, but you will get charged for it. Security costs money. Also, even if you do enable logging, there's a lot of different events. This is not exactly intuitive. You need to have somebody with good training set it up and be prepared to monitor it. Ideally, you want to get that sent to a central SIM where you're collecting those logs, but that can be a challenge to do. Matt Duran and I just did a talk on this called Cloud Threat Hunting. It's publicly available on the RSA website. So for those of you that are interested in getting data from all your cloud instances and pulling them into one place, check it out. And again, just trying to get visibility into what is happening in the cloud is going to cost you money. These are things we're very good at with our on-premise installations, but once it comes to the cloud, either the tools are not available or they're a lot harder to set up and it's going to cost you. Question I get a lot, how do you vet cloud providers? Well, you can't just take their word for it. If you call them and say, hey, are you secure? They're going to say, oh, we are super secure. We are so secure, 100% secure. But you have to do your due diligence. You'll find as one of your handouts a cloud cybersecurity checklist that goes through all the things that you're going to want to think about. Everything from access to sharing to what options are available for authentication. Are they going to let you know here in item 11? Will they let you know if there's a data breach? And if so, is it going to take them 6 months? How are they going to tell you? What are your options for backups, for monitoring and logs? Where physically in the world are they storing your data? Things like that. So take a look at that cloud cybersecurity checklist. Feel free to drop me a line on LinkedIn if you have any questions. So our defensive measures for the third threat are, number one, review your cloud configuration. That way you can prevent issues like the ones that happened to Capital One or the ones that happened to Microsoft. This just needs to become standard. If you're using the cloud, do cloud configuration reviews. At LMG, we have started doing those on a regular basis. Make sure you are enabling strong two-factor authentication. Remember, hackers don't break in, they log in. Centralize your monitoring and test it whenever possible because you don't want your team to have to log into AWS and also Azure and also all of your different on-site things. You want to go to one central platform to check and see what's going on. And vet your cloud providers like you vet any other supplier. Okay, we're just at the end here. Our next webinar is going to be March 25th. We're going to really jump into ransomware in even more depth. Ransomware is changing. Are you ready? That's at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Again, I'll provide these slides as a PDF afterwards. Just to recap, our top threats are ransomware and data exposure, that twist, supply chain exploitation, and cloud hacking. Our top defenses these are controllable risks, strong authentication, run, don't walk to multi-factor authentication, Make sure you're doing proactive threat hunting, preventing those phishing attacks. Make sure you have effective monitoring set up, outsource if you need it. Backups, always a good option since the beginning of internet time. Do your cloud configuration reviews. That's something new that you should be thinking about and budgeting for. Make sure you're taking a look at vendor login security measures and restricting access, logging access as well. And then do those supply chain risk assessments. Prioritize, don't let perfect get in the way of better. Feel free again to shoot me a message on LinkedIn or just connect. I'd love to sync up with you guys. And with that, we have a few minutes left for questions.
Thank you, Sherry. This is Stevie Friend again, the office moderator. We had a few questions that came in from our audience during the presentation. So starting with the first one, do you have any recommendations for phishing protection? Office 365 ATP still lets some phishing attempts in, and some have used Avanan on top of Office 365 and ATP. I'm curious what you think the best way to combat phishing attempts is.
Yeah, I was actually going to start by recommending Microsoft's ATP. It's built in. It's actually a very good tool. Beyond that, I try to avoid vendor-specific recommendations without knowing a little bit more about your company. So if you've already tried ATP, shoot me a line on LinkedIn and we can chat a little bit more.
Great. So we have another question. Recently, a friend of mine was in Las Vegas and someone grabbed his phone and put it on a charger type device. Now when someone calls his phone, he always has to restart it. I told him they were probably stealing information off your phone and he should call his provider. Any idea?
Yeah, that would really concern me. There have been many cases where malware is transmitted through a USB device connection. I'm always very creeped out by those, what are they, the ports in airports. You can get USB condoms that prevent data from going back and forth and only allow power to go back and forth. So that's always a good approach if you need to power your phone and you need to plug it into something with a USB connector. If someone has already used your phone and connected it up, I would treat it like an infected device. You probably want to do a factory reset. You may also want to scan it for malware. And if you have connected that, I would avoid connecting it to your other devices. If you've already connected it to your other devices, I would check those as well for malware.
Great, thank you, Sherry. We also had another question. What are your thoughts on using biometrics like Face ID or Touch ID fingerprints for personal devices or accounts? What types of unique risks do they pose?
I love biometrics. I think security needs to be convenient in order for it to be used, and they're a really nice replacement for passwords. They're not without their downsides. I don't know if you remember a couple years ago, there was a news report because a child had used their mother's fingerprint while she was sleeping to buy like $250 worth of Pokemon presents on Amazon. So you have to keep that in mind, that if someone's using your fingerprint, they might be able to get that while you're sleeping. My significant other is a twin, and both he and his twin are able to get into his high security data center, which is not what you want. So again, you might want to consider that combination of something you know and something you are, especially for higher security situations. But consider your risk profile. You know, if you're just trying to protect your Amazon account, maybe simply having a Touch ID is fine for you, and I think that's a totally reasonable choice.
Great, thank you, Sherry. So we'll end with one more question. If we add smart devices to our office, what should we be doing to prevent these from being used by attackers? Should there be things we look for before buying, installing certain devices such as smart thermostat, etc.?
Absolutely. I think step one with smart devices is to make sure they're not already being installed without your knowledge. Chances are something has already been plugged in without you knowing about it. I can't even tell you how many times, you know, a company gets a smart fridge or a smart coffee pot, and a vendor or maybe an employee will just plug it into the network without even thinking. And IT staff may not even know about it for quite some time. So step one, make sure you're tracking that inventory. Before you buy, make sure that the vendor is going to appropriately respond to cybersecurity threats. So they're going to proactively release patches. That's a big problem we see, where these devices never get patched, or that passwords are never reset. Another huge problem, we saw this with the Mirai botnet, is that the manufacturer installs a default password, and then when that's set up, it's never changed. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's not even possible to change the manufacturer's default password. So you need to make sure that the default password can be changed on any IoT devices, that you have control over that those patches are being installed, and I would also put them on a separate subnet. If you're going to allow remote access to those, carefully consider who has remote access and try not to make it available to the entire world. See if you can restrict it based on certain IP addresses or things like that. Great question.
Great, thank you, Sherry. And with that, we would like to thank everyone who attended. Please take a moment to fill out the survey afterwards and let us know what you thought. The recorded video from this presentation will be made available to attendees, and we will send out a notification once live. Thank you and have a great day.